Funding for the production and broadcast of the Cold War and beyond is provided by the TRW Foundation, the Mary W. Harriman Foundation, and the Nevada Test Site Historical Foundation.
The Cold War was the most dangerous era in the history of the world. This is the story of the nuclear arms race and its deadly consequence on today's world. By July 1945, the United States had developed 3 atomic bombs. They would be the world's first weapons of mass destruction. On July 16, 1945, the United States detonated the first bomb at White Sands, New Mexico, codenamed Trinity. This was the conclusion of the Manhattan Project in a race with Adolf Hitler's scientists. The explosion ushered in the nuclear age. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the other 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a means to end World War II. The average power of these initial weapons was 16 kilotons. During the years of the Cold War, there would be profound nuclear proliferation, and over 60,000 weapons would be manufactured, the vast majority by the United States and the former Soviet Union. These weapons would be an average of 100 kilotons, over 8 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Throughout the Cold War, use of nuclear weapons was considered or threatened on many occasions, but deterrence and sanity prevailed. Even as Russia and the United States have been decreasing their nuclear arsenal, there has been an increase of nuclear weapon states. Both India and Pakistan have developed and even threatened the use of nuclear weapons. Furthermore, a dark legacy of the era is the fear that weapons of mass destruction and Cold War technology are now in the hands of rogue states and terrorists. Consequently, in today's new world, it cannot be assumed the same degree of reason which occurred during the Cold War will prevail.
I have become the destroyer of the world. That is what Oppenheimer said minutes after first explosion.
You cannot really wage a war, nuclear war. It means mutual destruction and maybe destruction of the whole globe.
All of us had a total appreciation of how god-awful nuclear weapons were. Thank goodness the Soviets did too.
And some of the military, for the sake of keeping their ideological purity, so to speak, they said that during the nuclear conflagration, communism will win over capitalism. But it was all only for the sake of propaganda. Actually, the serious military understood quite well it will be the end of humankind.
When you think of the number of people involved and associated with these weapons over a 50-year period, and the potential for people going berserk, for crazy leaders, for all kinds of mistakes to be made, I think we were extraordinarily lucky.
One of the problems today is that there is no collective memory of what the Cold War was like. And you have a whole generation of people who've never lived in the Cold War and therefore think this was some sort of misunderstanding. That at the time, by every administration, was considered a life and death conflict and affecting the fundamental survival of the United States in many contests in many parts of the world.
Upon the conclusion of World War II, the only operational ballistic missiles were the German V-2 rockets, which had a range of about 200 miles. The Germans had fired 4,000 and averaged about 5 persons killed per weapon. By the end of the Cold War, a single missile would be 10 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Intercontinental ballistic missiles take only about a half hour to reach their targets. Both the United States and the Soviet Union developed and deployed early warning systems to enable a retaliatory response within the half hour between launch and impact. Both sides retained, however, the option of a first strike. Each side had 3 means of delivery: land-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles, and nuclear-capable bombers. The Soviets emphasized their land-based missile capability, and the United States emphasized submarines. The United States referred to the 3-pronged system of land-based missiles, sea-based missiles, and nuclear bombers as the triad. This relationship came to be called Mutual Assured Destruction, MAD. The populations of the United States and the Soviet Union were significantly at risk, and it has been postulated that a significant nuclear exchange would destroy the entire planet.
Each of us, the Soviets and the West, went through the same thought process. Each of us thought the other possessed the means to destroy us. And the way that each of us thought of preventing it from happening was to develop an action such that if the other initiated action to destroy us by firing nuclear weapons at us, we would be able to respond in ways that would inflict unacceptable damage on them. And that's what led to what was called the acronym MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction.
The intense drama of the Cold War was played out inside the Kremlin and the White House. The leaders of the 2 sides commanded each side of a global chessboard, where a significant miscalculation could have a deadly outcome. The interplay between Soviet and U.S. leaders proved to be a decisive factor in the Cold War. After the revolution in 1917, Soviet Russia assumed the responsibility of spreading communism. Lenin and his followers had dreamed of a wave of revolutions that would spread communism to all countries of the world. When Joseph Stalin gained control, he established his first priority, making the Soviet Union a world power.
And he was very tough, very cruel, with some Oriental kind of cruelty. And absolutely no respect to any principle or morality. And so he made out of the country 100% totalitarian power, destroying everything which was in his way, killing his best friends. He didn't spare even part of his family.
World War II provided Stalin and the Soviet Union an opportunity not only to expand territory, but to gain access to Western technology. However, deception and espionage still occurred in spite of the alliance between the Soviet Union and the West to defeat Hitler.
As we know now, Stalin had been kept fully informed of the progress of the development of the atom bomb throughout the war by the communist and communist sympathizers that unfortunately were among the people working at Los Alamos, most significant of which, of course, was Klaus Fuchs.
And Klaus Fuchs, for instance, who was the #1, of course, provider of intelligence information for the Russian nuclear project, he came himself to the Russian embassy in London in 1941, I think. And he offered his services. He was a German scientist working then in UK. And he offered it, and he did everything for free. He was offered money, but he categorically refused to take any money because he thought that Russia should also have this. It shouldn't be just one country.
Communism posed a unique threat to democratic political values and institutions. The Cold War was much more than a geopolitical contest between two competing superpowers. It was a battle of divergent political philosophies. The Second World War fully demonstrated Stalin's total authority. However, the price of victory was 27 million Soviet lives, a loss from which Russia is only beginning to recover. The beginning of the Cold War occurred after the death of Roosevelt, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan, and the conclusion of World War II.
On our side, we thought that we are entitled to security, but we overdid it with creating a buffer zone around our country. We wanted to include Turkey and Greece and Iran, and did it with all East European countries, and it was overdone and scared the West that we have expansionist aggressive intentions. The West, on the other side, exploded nuclear bomb. For us, this was the start of Cold War.
While attending the historical post-war conference in Potsdam in 1945, Stalin revealed his ultimate objective during a private conversation with Ambassador Averell Harriman.
But Harriman found himself alone in the garden of the famous palace of Sanssouci, just outside of Berlin in Potsdam, Frederick the Great's palace, with Stalin and an interpreter. And just to make conversation, he said to Stalin, "You must be very proud at having reached Berlin." And Harriman told the story quite often. He told it to me. I remember the first time he told it, it was really a shocking story, that Stalin just fixed him very coldly. Stalin had these very, what I call fish blue eyes, just fixed himself at Harriman, looked at him and said, "Tsar Alexander reached Paris." It was as clear a portrayal of ultimately what Stalin wanted, a goal that he would achieve if by political means, if he could, and by military means, if he could.
The Soviet Union maintained a military force of over 3 million. Stalin accelerated the process of spreading communism by taking advantage of Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe and the Far East. Further, he attempted to subjugate northern Iran, Turkey, and Greece. On the other hand, the United States was reducing its forces.
At the end of the war, we were dismantling our armed forces, we were pulling back, we were getting out of Europe as fast as possible. The defense budget was collapsing. But then came the Berlin blockade, the invasion of Korea, and that's what really started us back. Otherwise, we would have gone the way we did after World War I, which is withdraw.
The first phase of the Cold War began as bipolar brinkmanship between the leaders. As the United States began to understand that the Soviet Union was no longer allied, but becoming an adversary, George Kennan proposed that the Soviet action be met with a policy of containment.
I think that the article by George Kennan, which was the original impetus to the containment policy, it had a brilliant analysis of the Soviet Union, the consequences if it could not continue on its ideological crusade, the likelihood that the Soviet system would exhibit increasing internal weaknesses. And so as an intellectual effort, the cannon piece was brilliant. Then it was translated into foreign policy by Truman and Atchison into a holding the line, first in Europe and then everywhere where there was a communist threat.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent.
In 1947, President Truman formalized the U.S. decision to contain Soviet expansionism with the Truman Doctrine. In June 1947, General George Marshall proposed the ambitious Marshall Plan, a financial program to help all of war-torn Europe to recover from World War II.
President Truman was the proponent of the Marshall Plan. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, was the person that drafted the program. It was a major step forward in trying to rebuild and strengthen the economies of our European allies as well as our European enemies in the case of Germany.
It is a program of construction, production, and recovery. It menaces no one. It is designed specifically to bring to an end, in the shortest possible time, the dependence of these countries upon aid from the United States.
Stalin adamantly rejected the Marshall Plan for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. He perceived it as a way for the Americans to weaken the Soviet Union and its control over its satellites. The first military confrontation of the Cold War occurred in Berlin. On June 24, 1948, Stalin used the excuse of currency reform in the western sectors to blockade all rail, highway, and water traffic in and out of the city. In response, the United States and British Air Forces began an unprecedented airlift consisting of over 300,000 flights. This mission lasted for 14 months and delivered over 2 million tons of food and supplies to 2.5 million beleaguered Berliners.
I don't want to take anything away from the magnificent operation we call the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift was done out of necessity because we couldn't mount access on the ground without serious danger of confrontation up with which we could not have put. We feel so heroic about the airlift that we applaud ourselves because we could do it. But the reason we did it was because we couldn't go in there on the ground without severe risk. And the reason we couldn't go in there without severe risk is we were outnumbered probably 5 or 6 to 1, and we were outgunned probably 20 to 1.
Concurrently, Truman ordered 60 B-29 atomic bombers to U.S. Air Force bases in England and Germany. This was clearly a bluff because the Soviets were unaware there were no atomic bombs installed. Truman immediately ordered the escalation of atomic bomb production, which would rapidly evolve to building at the rate of nearly 1 a day. By 1952, the U.S. nuclear arsenal had reached 1,600 bombs. Thus, the Berlin blockade began the arms race and resulted in the first European deployment of U.S. nuclear weapons.
From the Soviet viewpoint, of course, the first thing was to have its own bomb. That's how, because without that, Soviet communists couldn't survive. I mean, it was quite clear.
By the end of the 1940s, the Chinese communists had won control of all of mainland China, and the Soviet Union had exploded its first atomic bomb, which added to the increasing European uneasiness over the immense size of the Soviet forces that were dramatically changing the East-West balance of power. The delivery system for atomic bombs for both the Soviet Union and the U.S. was manned, propeller-driven bombers, which were slow-moving and vulnerable. Eventually, both sides had radar for detection and jet fighters for interception. At the end of World War II, the Korean peninsula was arbitrarily divided at the 38th parallel to facilitate the surrender of the Japanese troops. With the help of Stalin, a communist government was established in the north. The North Korean forces, helped also by the People's Republic of China, were far superior to the South Korean military. With no warning, on June 25, 1950, the North Korean forces invaded South Korea. This invasion had full support from Stalin and Mao Zedong. On June 27th, President Truman authorized air and naval forces to resist communist aggression in Korea.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world.
Further, the Security Council of the United Nations ratified Truman's decision. 16 member nations joined American forces and fought against North Korean and Chinese troops for 3 years on the Korean peninsula. The cost of lives was 54,000 U.S. troops, approximately 3,200 United Nations troops, 500,000 People's Republic of China troops, 3 million Koreans, and an unknown number of Soviet pilots who fought on behalf of North Korea and China. Europe was the crucible of the Cold War, but the fighting and dying during the era mostly occurred in Asia, Africa, and Central America. Korea would be the largest armed conflict during the Cold War, where American servicemen would fight directly against Soviet and Chinese forces. After the Chinese entered the war in November 1950 and drove the UN forces back from the Chinese border, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the United Nations forces, publicly advocated expanding the war into China. On April 11, 1951, President Truman, with support of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dismissed MacArthur from all of his commands because his objectives were in conflict with U.S. policy of containment. With Stalin's death and the election of Eisenhower as president, a new chapter began in the Cold War. In September of 1953, after an extensive power struggle, Nikita Khrushchev became the first secretary of the Central Committee. After a failed coup against him in 1957, he assumed direct control of the Soviet government as well. Under Eisenhower and Khrushchev, tensions continued. The policy of containment, backed by military strength, was the strategy of the Eisenhower presidency.
We have learned, too, that the cost of defending freedom, of defending America, must be paid in many forms.
And the idea of drawing a line, making it clear to the Soviets that if they ever transgressed into areas that we had committed ourselves to defend, they would be hit with everything that we had. And that was essentially the line of policy that we had.
President Eisenhower was committed to ending the Korean War. The U.S. had atomic warheads on Okinawa, and the Communists knew Eisenhower's patience was wearing thin.
In the fall of 1950, when everything was going bad, and it was a question whether we'd be able to hang on down in the Pusan perimeter, there were various ideas on the use of nuclear weapons.
Consequently, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, to end the war in Korea. Although U.S. policy of limited war had prevailed in Korea, the principle of nuclear deterrence and the consequent arms race had begun in full.
Осталось
1 minuta.
During the 1950s, a dangerous reality evolved in the Cold War. The hydrogen bomb and the intercontinental ballistic missile, called ICBM, were developed and perfected, reducing response time from several hours to several minutes. It was widely believed the Soviets were well ahead of the U.S. in ICBM and compact nuclear weapon development. Eisenhower wanted to improve and expand the American delivery system. He felt the earliest development of ICBM capability was of vital importance to the security of the United States.
I think the Eisenhower's decision to develop ICBMs was crucial. And there's a possibility that we'd have not had the necessary military force to bring the Cold War to a successful conclusion.
In 1956, in a secret speech, Khrushchev stunned the Soviet inner circle by condemning Stalin's terror.
And Khrushchev, I think, felt that he cannot go on like Stalin. He has to make it different. And he wanted to go into history. He was a human being, finally. He felt it was awful what Stalin did. But, you know, Khrushchev was a very primitive man. He concentrated everything on Stalin's personality. Stalin was really a devil, a genius of all bad things. Khrushchev was the first to render the blow to Stalinism and to totalitarian regime in our country, and therefore he will remain in history.
In October 1956, riots took place in Budapest, protesting Soviet rule in Hungary. Hungarian freedom fighters were initially successful. However, on November 4th, the Soviets returned in overwhelming strength, and the Hungarians were crushed.
The events in Poland and in Hungary, they scared the political elite here, that it can go too far. So better make the screws tighter now and don't let the steam out.
The final result was the death of at least 4,000 Hungarians and 700 Soviet troops. The United States avoided direct involvement in the conflict, but did provide assistance to the refugees pouring out of Hungary. Although the Eisenhower administration had come into office on a commitment to roll back the communists, its policy remained one of containment.
And our strategy basically was just try to hold the line, be patient, not kill communism in its crib or anything, but just be patient. I think was the wise course. Against a lot of people in the early days of the Cold War said, look, there's going to be a war between us and the Soviet Union. We ought to fight it when we're better than they are. I think our steady-as-she-goes strategy was just right.
A crisis in self-confidence consumed the West with a stunning Soviet achievement on October 4th, 1957. With its firing into orbit the world's first man-made satellite, named Sputnik. Although it weighed less than 200 pounds and carried no scientific or military equipment, this event seemed to herald a Soviet technological lead in the evolution of the Cold War. The result rallied the American scientific and education community to action, and most specifically, the U.S. missile program.
And I remember the day when Sputnik orbited the Earth. It woke up everybody, including the United States. Then finally started to focus things.
Sputnik had aroused fear with the U.S. and its allies that there was a missile gap. In late 1957, the U.S. deployed Jupiter missiles in Turkey, bringing home to the Soviets the reality of U.S. ability to launch strikes against Kiev, Moscow, and other major Soviet cities. President Eisenhower needed intelligence information from within the Soviet Union. The result was the creation of a camera that made high-level precision photographs, mounted within a high-altitude, single-engine reconnaissance jet aircraft with the ability to fly long distances above 70,000 feet. The aircraft was called the U-2. It was to fly too high for Soviet anti-aircraft missiles or fighters. The U.S. Air Force utilized 48 U-2 spy planes, which flew from bases in Japan, Pakistan, Turkey, and Britain. They would stay in the air for 12 hours, mapping and photographing the vast Soviet landmass, its air and missile bases, and factories.
Khrushchev, being afraid of American attack, always has overplayed our military might. All this braggery that we produce rockets like sausages. I know that there were even special troops which have built false rockets and rocket positions just for Americans to see it. Because we wanted to look stronger than we were. We thought that in this way we will hold Americans at bay. They will not attack us.
In May 1960, as Eisenhower prepared for a new summit with Khrushchev in Paris, the CIA pressed for one last mission to determine if there might be a missile plant or base near the Urals, in an area which had only been sketchily surveyed. It was one mission too many. A Soviet anti-aircraft missile finally found its mark, a U-2 and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers.
Eisenhower knew that this would be used over the Soviet Union. He was determined first that it would not be flown by people in uniform, because that, as he described it, that was an act of war if you did that. But it could be done on a clandestine basis, so-called the plausible deniability theory. And he also was well aware that this was a confrontation, it was a humiliation for the Soviets, but every time he evaluated this, he decided that the information was important enough to pay that, really pay that cost.
And for Khrushchev, you know, he was a very emotional man, temperamental. To know that a plane, a spy plane, is flying over Soviet Union on the eve of summit meeting, when they have already resolved the question of future relations with Eisenhower, was a really big insult.
And at that point, Khrushchev sprung the trap on us, and he said, we not only have the plane, we have the pilot, we know that he was engaged in a spy mission.
The Paris Summit Conference broke down as a result of the U-2 incident.
So we really had handled it, I would say, in a very clumsy way. One reason being that we had been assured by the CIA people that if this were ever shot down, the pilot could not be expected to survive.
Francis Gary Powers was convicted and imprisoned. In February 1962, he was exchanged for Soviet spy Rudolf Abel and returned to the U.S. By the end of the 1950s, the Soviets were the first in space with Sputnik, and this created a perception in the U.S. that there was a missile gap. Both sides had smaller, lighter nuclear weapons that could be delivered by intercontinental missiles or by medium-range missiles. It was true. The Soviets had 30 crude ICBMs deployed, while the U.S. had just started deployment of its first ICBM, the Atlas. However, U.S.-made Thor and Jupiter medium-range ballistic missiles already threatened the Soviet Union from bases in Europe. The Soviet Union had deployed the first submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and the U.S. had embarked on a crash program in nuclear submarines and solid-fuel Polaris missiles. Both sides still relied on long-range, high-altitude bombers, but now used jet propulsion instead of propeller-driven bombers. Finally, U.S. spy satellites were beginning to evolve. Overhead surveillance and reconnaissance played a major role in intelligence gathering during the last 30 years of the Cold War. Keeping track of enemy developments, capabilities, and intentions grew into a major activity on both sides of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War. The three major categories of intelligence were gathered by photographic imaging, electronic eavesdropping, as well as human spying and analysis. Hundreds of billions of dollars were spent on equipment, and many lives were lost, but strategic stability was enhanced and miscalculations were avoided.
With the deployment, first of the U-2 and then of our first imaging satellites, CIA's ability to track what the Soviets actually had on the ground would never again be called into question, would never again be wrong. CIA and the American intelligence community from the early 1960s on had a very accurate picture of the existing Soviet forces.
I guess it's impossible with the help of satellites to learn everything what we had in the Soviet Union, because there were certain things we had in our minds and in our hearts. No ideas and no intentions could be observed from the satellites. We had our sources in American centers who were analyzing results of the satellite survey. I held in my hands your images of our territory. Since the subject was our military objects, I sent them to the Defense Ministry in order to know how much I should pay for them and if they were correct or not.
In 1961, there was a changing of the guard in Washington. The presidential torch was passed from Dwight Eisenhower to John Kennedy, but a beat was not missed in the Cold War as brinkmanship resumed.
The presidential election in 1960, which Kennedy was elected, was fought in part on the issue of the missile gap. As it turned out, there wasn't a missile gap, but Russia appeared to be ahead in space. And in a sense, there was great concern in this country we were falling behind technologically and militarily. And therefore, when Khrushchev said, we'll bury you, there were people in the country that feared that that was our destiny. And we were determined, the Kennedy administration, as I think President Eisenhower had been, was determined to prevent that.
Khrushchev and Kennedy were due for a showdown. U.S. failure at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 was followed by the building of the most notorious symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall. At precisely 0230 hours on August 13, 1961, East German troops and workmen began to build a wall which divided East and West Berlin. Its purpose was to stop the growing flood of East Germans into West Berlin, which was an economic drain for the East German government, an embarrassment to the entire socialist bloc. The construction was to become Khrushchev's most enduring monument in Europe, and it would stand for the next 28 years, during which time 190 people would die attempting to escape across the wall. Throughout the remainder of the Cold War, the 17 million people within the German Democratic Republic, as East Germany called itself, would now be confined to its borders. Concurrently with the construction of the wall, the Soviets also conducted a series of 30 nuclear tests during the next 2 months, culminated by the detonation of a 58-megaton device. October 1962 was arguably the most dangerous time in the history of the world. The treacherous high-stakes chess game being played between Khrushchev and Kennedy would evolve into clearly the most dramatic event of the Cold War. Khrushchev would make the first move.
So he decided to send missiles to Cuba, which was one of the biggest mistakes he made. He underestimated Kennedy.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
The whole framework of Cold War has a couple of times brought us to the brink of hot war. And one of this situation was Cuban Missile Crisis.
Khrushchev's public reason for situating the nuclear-tipped missiles was to safeguard Cuba against another U.S. invasion. However, his real reason was to provide the Soviets a nuclear option 90 miles off the U.S. coast. Also, he was determined to counter the U.S. missiles which had been placed in Turkey in the mid-1950s.
You know, we didn't have at this time dependable intercontinental missiles. Our planes could make it only one way. So we reached some parity with Americans in nuclear weapons, but not in means of delivery. And the closest place to bring them was Cuba. And he thought, why? The Americans have their missiles in Turkey. Why can't we have them in Cuba?
The ultimate response by Kennedy was a strict quarantine on all offensive weapons being shipped to Cuba and the insistence on the removal of the Soviet missiles. A naval blockade of Cuba was established and a direct confrontation was threatened if the missiles were not removed. The United States and the Soviet Union raised their nuclear forces to the highest alert short of war. This was to be the highest alert Soviet and American forces were to ever reach during the Cold War. The world was within hours of a military showdown, which could escalate to a full nuclear exchange. The U.S. had totally underestimated the strength of the Soviet force in Cuba.
We didn't know half of what we should have known. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was Saturday, October 27, 1962, we had photographs, of course, of the intermediate range missiles. We knew they were there. But the CIA stated they did not believe the warheads had yet been delivered. They thought the first 20 were coming on a ship named the Poltava. The majority of President Kennedy's military and civilian advisors were prepared to recommend attack unless the Soviets moved those missiles out immediately. It wasn't until 29 years later that we learned there were 162 nuclear warheads on the soil of Cuba, roughly 90 tactical warheads to confront a U.S. invasion, and roughly 70 or so to be launched against East Coast cities, putting 90 million Americans at risk.
In the end, Khrushchev would be forced to back down and agreed to remove the missiles. Later, it was learned a confidential accord had been agreed to by the U.S. and the Soviets. Publicly, Khrushchev would agree to remove the missiles, and privately, Kennedy agreed to withdraw American missiles from Turkey and pledged not to invade Cuba.
The deal was that if we agreed not to invade Cuba, Khrushchev would take the missiles out under UN supervision. We had no intention of invading Cuba, other than to get the missiles out. If they were taken out, we had no intention of invading Cuba. So we were paying no price, if you wish. He did take the missiles out, but he didn't take them out under UN supervision. In lieu of that, we flew over the decks of the ships taking the missiles out, and we counted the missiles as they went out.
Kennedy had previously decided to remove the obsolete Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but now felt this was the right time. However, only on one condition.
Kennedy decided that we were going to take those out, and he instructed Bobby Kennedy to tell Dobrynin, to tell Khrushchev, that missiles in Turkey would be taken out, but not as a part of a deal relating to Cuba. And if Khrushchev ever indicated otherwise, would put them back in.
The public humiliation of Khrushchev would result in cutting short his political career and would ultimately ignite a fierce arms race, which lasted for the next 29 years. However, those 13 days in October 1962, known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, would be the most perilous moment of the Cold War.
We came that close to nuclear war, and we didn't even know how close we were until 20 or 30 years later. The lesson, therefore, is not that it was the best managed foreign policy crisis and the best managed defense policy crisis of the last 50 years. I think it was. But that's not why we avoided nuclear war. We lucked out in the end. Khrushchev lucked out and Kennedy lucked out.
A crisis which perhaps was needed to explain to the leaders and to the public what is nuclear weapons. Because without that crisis, it's not that, please don't think that I want this crisis to happen again and I wanted this, but it happened that way. And after that crisis, it was clear that nuclear weapons is no weapons at all. So nuclear weapons ended as nuclear weapons during that crisis. And since then, it's mostly a political instrument of influence, of prestige, of pressure, but not a weapon. It's no weapon.
I saw the brilliant light, just absolutely brilliant light through the goggles, and then you hear strange sounds, you hear rumblings and things like that, and I was unprepared for the shock wave, and I was unprepared for the heat, and we were told we could take our goggles off, but you could actually see the shock wave coming across the desert. You could see the desert rolling sort of towards you, coming at you, and a very strange feeling. And if you weren't prepared, it would, the shock wave would knock you down when it came by. I wasn't quite ready for what I saw. People in command authority should see an atmospheric nuclear test to really understand the forces that are at work here. You don't get that impression from looking at movies and looking at data. You have to be there, and it's an instrument of war. It's a terrible, terrible thing.
Russian and American school children in the 1950s practiced civil defense drills to prepare for feared nuclear attack by their enemies' high-altitude bombers. Air raid shelters were created for and by ordinary citizens. Underground, long-term hardened shelters were created for military and civilian government officials. Atmospheric nuclear weapons tests were conducted between 1948 and 1963, utilizing ever more powerful bombs. The largest was a 58-megaton airburst by the Soviet Union on October 31, 1961. Fallout from these tests left no region on Earth untouched by radioactive debris. A U.S. test in 1954 resulted in the accidental contamination of a Japanese fishing vessel, the Lucky Dragon, and its crew suffered radiation sickness. Radioactive rain from a Soviet hydrogen bomb test fell directly on Japan. Contamination of the environment and genetic damage was becoming a widespread fear. The handling of radioactive material is extremely hazardous. During the early days of experimentation, there were several accidents and deaths occurred. The physical effect of acute radiation syndrome was documented by the laboratory at Los Alamos.
They were using materials that we never experimented with before. There were measurements attempted that had never been done before. We were working in time domains where people had never tried to measure things that happened that fast. And then on top of that, you still had to deal with things like the meteorological conditions. What's the weather going to be like, not only at the time of the shot, but 24 hours later and 48 hours later. And a lot of the things that happened in those days had to do with weather changes, where the fallout that you knew was a result of the test was carried places that you hadn't either predicted or intended for it to go. That was certainly the case at the test site in the early years, where higher than predicted levels of radiation got into Utah, for example, and that certainly was the case with the fishing vessel in Bikini.
After 8 years of negotiations, some moratoriums on testing, arguments on linkage to conventional forces, nuclear disarmament, and issues of verification, the Soviet Union, US, and United Kingdom in 1963 ratified a treaty banning nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. This first major treaty was signed by over 100 nations, but never received the agreement of France, one of the nuclear powers. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved the insanity of bipolar brinkmanship. A new period unfolded that came to be known as détente, from Kennedy versus Khrushchev to Reagan versus Gorbachev. Direct confrontation was replaced by wars in third world countries and bipolar efforts to avoid nuclear conflict, all done in the shadow of a continuing arms buildup driven by the Soviet Union maintaining its pursuit of world domination. There was also a changing of the guard at the leadership level. On November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas, John F. Kennedy fell victim to an assassin's bullet. And Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency. In October 1964, Nikita Khrushchev was relieved of his duties by a secret session of the Central Committee. Leonid Brezhnev evolved as the party general secretary, and Alexei Kosygin became Soviet prime minister. Although Brezhnev later emerged as the overall Soviet leader, Kosygin remained in charge of the day-to-day operation of the Soviet government. Within this phase of the Cold War, there would be no direct confrontation between the US and Soviets, and there would be strategic arms limitation discussions. However, there would also be indirect aggression in third world countries and arms buildup, which would become reckless and profound. The Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis served to impose stability in US and Soviet relations, but US concern about expansionist China was a constant theme. An American foreign policy objective was to establish a containment of Chinese communism.
The word pilot to King got. Golf 1 is Golf 6, brother. I want more. That's what's good. Put it right up.
Consequently, it was perceived that Ho Chi Minh's determination to control both North and South Vietnam was part of China's expansionist strategy. It was further deduced the loss of South Vietnam to communism would undermine the credibility of American commitments elsewhere and lead to greater communist authority in Asia. The concept was identified as the domino theory.
Vietnam was viewed by the Eisenhower administration, by the Kennedy and by the Johnson administrations as a major part of the Cold War. That was the way we saw it. We saw it as a stepping stone for the extension by the communists of their hegemony across East and Southeast Asia. The domino theory, which in retrospect was probably wrong.
On August 2nd, 1964, the U.S. mounted its first airstrikes against North Vietnam. This attack was triggered by an incident in the Gulf of Tonkin, where the U.S. Navy destroyer Maddox was thought to have been attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats in international waters.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Of course, our sympathies were on the side of North Vietnam and Viet Cong. Like other people who were under colonial rule. At the same time, we didn't interfere, but what we did, we sold them weapons, and we have just given them weapons.
Much like in Korea, the use of nuclear weapons was considered as an option in Vietnam.
There was reference to the use of nuclear weapons in connection with Vietnam. Some studies made by the Joint Staff and the Joint Chiefs considered that possibility, particularly in the sense that consideration was given to introducing U.S. forces into North Vietnam. And the chiefs were honest enough to say that if that occurred, it was possible the Chinese and or the Russians would respond by introducing their forces, large numbers of their ground forces, into North Vietnam. And in that event, said the chiefs, it might be necessary for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons.
The war in Vietnam would cost the lives of 58,000 U.S. military. However, there are no accurate figures available for all North and South Vietnamese military and civilian deaths, but it's estimated that the death toll could extend as high as 2 million. The Glassboro Summit in New Jersey proved to be the beginning of arms control negotiations.
It started in the 60s in Glassboro. That was the first time when the two sides touched an untouchable subject, nuclear arms. But that was, since it was the first time that they talked about it, it was too difficult. The sides were not prepared. But a little step was made.
The dialogue between the Soviet Union and the U.S. during these years of the Cold War in the mid-1960s was very, very ineffective. We weren't communicating adequately. We didn't understand each other. And the result of serious confrontation and misjudgment was very, very great. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, we did introduce the hotline, but it wasn't used from the time it was introduced in 1963 until June of 1967 in connection with the Six-Day War between Egypt and Israel.
Tensions evolved during the 1967 Six-Day War. The Soviets misunderstood a U.S. military action, and a sobering message was communicated on the hotline.
The exchange of messages between Kosygin and Johnson included a message from Kosygin to Johnson that said, in effect, if you want war, you'll get it. Now, we obviously didn't want war. He misunderstood what we were doing. We perhaps misunderstood what he was doing, but that was the terrible risk we feared that Syria might intervene to support Egypt against Israel, and that the Soviet Union might support Syria, and that we would then have a conflict between a Syrian and Russian-supported offense against Israel. And we turned the Sixth Fleet around and been steaming west on a training mission in the Mediterranean. We turned it around to sail back east to be available in the event it was needed to defend Israel against a Soviet-backed Syrian attack on Israel. And that's what led them to this exchange of messages. Said, if you want war, you'll get war. But it's typical of the misunderstandings that existed during that period and the great danger to the peace of the world in the Cold War.
As the war in Vietnam escalated, the Soviet Union was busy diffusing a government-led revolutionary change in Czechoslovakia. An effort for democratization in the country was contrary to the established system within the Communist Empire. Consequently, at 11 p.m. on Sunday, August 20th, 1968, the Soviet Army invaded Czechoslovakia with a force of 250 to 300,000 troops. By the end of August, Soviet troop buildup would soar to 600,000. A wave of protests swept the world, and even in the Soviet Union there was demonstrated opposition to the act. But at the end of the day, much like the 1956 revolt in Hungary, the West chose not to commit themselves militarily on the territory of the Warsaw Pact. Unlike the Hungarian Revolution, which took 4 months, the Czechoslovakia crisis lasted for 2 years. The floodgates had opened in Vietnam, and there was significant escalation of combat troops. The impact would be tragic. The war would divide the U.S. and destroy the Johnson presidency. The ethical and political perception of the United States was on trial, even by its own citizens. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. In the decade of the 1960s, the Soviet Union deployed a total of 1,710 single nuclear warhead ballistic missiles targeted at the United States. The United States, on the other hand, had a total of 1,694 warheads targeted on the Soviet Union. Mutual assured destruction was now a reality. The Soviet Union would not be faced down in future confrontations.
The Nixon administration inherited a war in Vietnam, in which, at that point, not one negotiation had taken place on substance, and no real strategy existed for ending the war. There were no relations with China. In fact, there was no contact whatever with China. The Soviet Union had just occupied Czechoslovakia, so there was a very tense period with the Soviet Union. The Berlin issue was still open, and it was in the aftermath of the Middle East War of 1967, and that was another totally frozen situation. First of all, the analysis was that the United States had got itself into this stalemate by setting objectives beyond its capacity to reach, and that some relationship had to be established between what the American public would support and what our foreign policy was.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union was determined to match the U.S. nuclear arsenal. But also, there was desire by both sides to relax the Cold War tension. Thus, the policy of détente evolved. The approach to the policy and objectives differed between the two superpowers.
Our basic view was this. We, that is Nixon and I, thought we were potentially stronger than the Soviet Union. But we were in a period of great stress due to the need to liquidate the Vietnam War and our profound domestic divisions. And in any event, we could not ask the American public to brave the dangers of the existing Cold War without a demonstration that we had done what we could do to ease tensions so that if conflicts arose, it was clear that no alternative existed.
Détente was welcomed very much in Russia because it was understood as the end of this, threat of war and all of it, and opening to new relations.
The designers of the U.S. approach were Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. Their approach was to work in secret and set up summit meetings in Moscow and Beijing. Their immediate objective was to gain assistance from the Soviets and China to help the U.S. get out of Vietnam, which at this point was completely out of hand. They also wanted to establish diplomatic relations with China.
China had to be brought into the global diplomacy. But having the idea didn't yet guarantee that one knew how to carry it out. We developed impetus behind that idea because the Soviet Union overplayed its hand in a border conflict with China. And that gave us a whole new perspective, namely, could we see China turned into another Czechoslovakia? That led us into beginning approaches to China, some indirect, some direct. The Chinese had the profoundest distrust of any of these European communists as being Soviet stooges. And since the incentive of the Chinese to move towards us was fear of the Soviet Union, at least part of the incentive.
This led to Nixon's trip to China, which stunned the Soviets.
Nixon will make a visit to China. There was something like hysteria here. And I even tried to calm it down, Brezhnev was on vacation, so I visited the second man in command here. And I told him that it is not normal. It harms us in our relations with the United States and with China.
It was an important move by U.S. diplomacy, which had a very strong impact on the Soviet Union. So it immediately caused a lot of concern in Moscow. The vision of two powers, China and the United States, getting together against the Soviet Union. And it immediately prompted, first of all, to increase our efforts to improve the relationship with China and to improve the relationship with the United States.
On May 22, 1972, Nixon also became the first serving U.S. president to visit Moscow. The summit served to establish the foundation for détente. The two sides managed to reach agreements on the limitation of offensive and defensive nuclear weapons, referred to as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT.
Nixon and I looked at the Strategic Arms Limitation talks as a way to have a dialogue with the Soviet Union on a subject that affected the survival of both of us, where we could educate the Soviet Union in our perceptions and where it was possible to make adjustments without the confrontations that would exist necessarily if a line were challenged.
On June 8, 1973, Brezhnev came to the U.S. for a second summit with Nixon, and the process of détente continued. The Watergate scandal, however, ended Richard Nixon's presidency. On August 8, 1974, Nixon announced his resignation, and Gerald Ford assumed the presidency.
When I had took the oath of office on August 9, 1974, the country was in real disarray, not only at home but abroad. The Watergate scandal was a tragedy. We were still involved, unfortunately, in the war in Vietnam. We were having our serious negotiations with Mr. Brezhnev about SALT, etc. So I inherited a desk full of problems that had to be tackled immediately and hopefully successfully.
The Vietnam War, Watergate, and Nixon's resignation had left the U.S. in disarray. Further, the Soviets were confused. Many thought the Watergate scandal and presidential resignation were really a coup against the policy of détente.
So people were astonished. Why do the Americans make such a fuss about it? Finally, it was done by the president. Why couldn't he do it? That all of it is because he has concluded a treaty, SALT I treaty with Soviet Union.
At the other extreme, in relations with the Soviet Union, at first it didn't make any significant difference because they couldn't believe what they were seeing was going on. So they had no category for understanding the disintegration of a major government. And so for a year or so, it didn't make any difference as far as the Soviet conduct was concerned.
Arms control negotiations helped to establish a continued dialogue between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Arms control gave us regular meetings and discussions, sometimes acrimonious, but at least we had something to talk about. But secondly, and more fundamentally for me, arms control was important to reduce the chances that these two camps, armed to the teeth, either one of which could launch a nuclear strike within 30 minutes, to reduce the chances that some kind of a crisis would result in a war.
The arms control negotiations was actually an important and maybe much impressive vehicle of destroying the Cold War psychology. And I remember when we started the talks, it was so secret. The figures about how many missiles, how many launchers, how many warheads, etc., were so enormously secret. Arms control negotiations, strategically, it was important because it has created the atmospherics of trust.
But they were very tough, and they were past masters at negotiating because their negotiators had all gone to the Red Academy and studied negotiations, and particularly studied the United States. So they knew everything about us and knew our weaknesses and knew how to split people one from the other in the democratic society.
It's knowledge of each other, the knowledge of mindsets of each other, psychology, backgrounds, and so on. It wouldn't be possible to have all these extremely important agreements that are still in force.
However, a summit conference could prove to be a stressful event for arms control negotiators and staff. This would occur especially when a U.S. president and the Soviet leader would conduct private meetings.
Staff people, including secretaries of state, hate summit meetings and hate having the heads of state or heads of government go off by themselves because there's no telling what these damn fools might do. And so everybody gets nervous. And the truth is, most presidents had no clue as to the intricate negotiating details of these strategic arms agreements and so on. Most of the presidents that I ever worked for, and I worked for 6 of them, their eyes glazed over on this arms control stuff very fast.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty and later the Strategic Arms Limitation and Reduction Treaty alleviated tensions.
And I remember Mr. Gromyko, the foreign minister, saying once that this is the only tiny silk thread that connects us at this point.
Limiting strategic nuclear arms buildup proved to be a much more difficult and protracted activity than the 2 major treaties of the 1970s. While these treaties each accomplished useful results, the total warheads that were on ballistic missiles when the first treaty was signed in 1972 increased to over 13,000 by 1980 and reached 18,000 by the end of the Cold War. Strategic stability was based on mutual assured destruction. Neither side could allow the other even a remote possibility of a first strike victory. The best efforts of the arms control negotiators did not prevent a five-fold buildup of strategic nuclear weapons. Here is what happened. The anti-ballistic missile ABM Treaty and SALT I limited ABMs to 100 per side and offensive ballistic missiles to those already in existence, about 1,700 single warhead missiles each, and it left open the option to deploy multiple independently targeted re-entry vehicle warheads, or MIRVs. As a result, the Cold War entered a new and even more threatening phase of the arms race, with each side adding more than one new nuclear warhead per day for 10 years.
The Soviets overextended themselves. They were producing too many of nuclear weapons, too many of missiles of different kinds. So the arms race went out of control in case of both countries, but in particular in case of the Soviet Union.
In this dangerous environment, President Ford and General Secretary Brezhnev met at Vladivostok in November 1974 and produced a new agreement, limiting heavy bombers and MIRV systems, as well as ICBMs and SLBMs.
I went to Vladivostok fully confident that we had a good program to reduce their missiles, their nuclear threat, at the same time to reduce our own capabilities in an honest negotiation. And for 2.5 days, Brezhnev and I head-to-head negotiated on how we could reduce this nuclear challenge to the two nations, the two superpowers, but to the world as a whole. When we finished, we had accomplished about 90 to 95% of what we started out to achieve. But I was confident that Congress would approve and the American people would approve what we had done. And hopefully in 1976, we could finalize this very significant agreement.
SALT II was not signed until 1979 and never ratified due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was now proclaiming itself to be a superpower equal to the U.S., but there was a backlash in the U.S. Congress against the policy of détente. Questions related to human rights in the Soviet Union became a significant issue. It concerned the treatment of Soviet dissidents like writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn and restrictions on the immigration of Soviet Jews. In the Soviet Union, détente had few enemies. It had quietly built its military capabilities and strengthened its hold on Vietnam, Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America. Soviet leaders also hoped to guarantee its status by signing a treaty at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was held on July 30th and August 1st, 1975 in Helsinki. The Soviet Union perception was that this treaty would recognize the post-war division of Europe, but for the Soviet Union, the human rights provision became a ticking time bomb.
In retrospect, I would say the Helsinki Accords is as important historically in the post-World War II period as the Marshall Plan, NATO. Those three policies or programs eventually undercut the communist leaders in Russia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, etc.
The Helsinki Accords established a protocol for safeguarding human rights in the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact nations. This was to become a major factor in leading to the eventual conclusion of the Cold War.
Human rights issue, which started in Helsinki, but then became one of the most important elements of bilateral negotiations between Washington and Moscow, played an important role in softening the situation in the Soviet Union, because it put on the agenda of the Soviet leaders an issue which was never there before. But it was a huge psychological problem for the Soviet leaders.
And it really started the last wave of not rebellion, but resistance inside Eastern Europe, which culminated in the late 80s with the tearing down of the wall and the self-liberation, if you will, of Eastern Europe.
In addition to developing Earth-threatening nuclear capability to ensure strategic parity, both the United States and the Soviet Union initiated programs to produce chemical and biological weapons. The chemical programs were similar, but the biological programs significantly diverged. In the chemical weapon programs, both countries produced and poured into weapons tens of thousands of tons of lethal chemicals, and rough strategic parity was achieved. Biological weapon capabilities, on the other hand, were handled in very different manners. President Nixon stopped the United States' pursuit of biological weapons in 1969 and pushed for the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention of 1972, which banned research and production. The Soviet Union, which signed the treaty, not only did not stop the research and production of biological agents, but instead created a super-secret organization called Biopreparat, which supported as many as 50,000 people. They developed extremely lethal anthrax spores and other agents, as well as methods of delivery that included tactical ballistic missiles with a range of 300 to 500 miles. They also envisaged mobile production and weapon-making capability. By the 1980s, the Soviet military was prepared for an all-out chemical and biological war. The United States was similarly prepared for chemical warfare, but had abandoned its biological program 2 decades earlier. Within the American landscape in 1976, a new face emerged. Jimmy Carter was elected president and brought with him a new political agenda.
We had a number of objectives, but perhaps most broadly, I was of the view that a détente with the Soviet Union, which had been initiated earlier by Nixon and continued by Ford, to be viable, had to be genuinely reciprocal. My judgment was that the détente that was being pursued at the time was not genuinely reciprocal, but was being exploited in a one-sided fashion by the Soviet Union, in effect to gain strategic preponderance for it. And I felt that had to be redressed.
At Vladivostok in November 1974, Leonid Brezhnev and Gerald Ford established an interim agreement on nuclear arms reductions. The agreement established common ceilings for strategic weapons. Jimmy Carter, however, wanted to go much further.
With regards to SALT, our position was that deeper cuts were desirable and should be pursued, that the Soviet effort to gain a strategic upper hand would best be met if we were to convince them that if there aren't deep cuts, we would build up.
Uncertain of Carter, the Soviets bluntly rejected Carter's approach.
When we looked at that, Dobrynin and myself, the two of us, we said, that's going to be a problem. If the secretary goes to Moscow with those proposals, our relationship would suffer enormously. Let's stop them. Let's do something that they should not go to Moscow with that. Let's them work on that again. So we talked with the Secretary Vance and with Brzezinski, and saying that it wouldn't go. You just don't have to do it, because you really, what you have done, you destroyed all the previous platforms. You can improve things which were done before, but you can't destroy the basis of the negotiations.
Because of the Soviet reaction, the Carter administration was divided on the best way to implement a SALT II agreement.
I was not too surprised. I also felt that we shouldn't move to our fallback position too quickly, but some other members of the administration favored going to the fallback position. I felt that if we were to stand fast, eventually the Soviets would come around, which they did, but only 2 years later.
In the late 1970s, the Soviets began to deploy a new intermediate-range nuclear missile, the SS-20. They were targeted toward Western Europe. Intermediate missiles were not included in the SALT II negotiations. The U.S. questioned the strategy on the deployment of the SS-20s.
I think what really happened is that the Soviet Union, watching us in the aftermath of Vietnam and the turmoil which Vietnam caused inside the United States, the aftermath of Watergate, they really thought that the United States was maybe not collapsing, but weakening badly. And I think in the latter part of the 1970s, they thought they were on a roll and we were falling behind. And so I think their strategy was to press their advantage. They overdid themselves. That's when they went into Afghanistan, for example. That's when they deployed the SS-20. And both of them turned out to be disasters because the SS-20 served to remobilize NATO.
In the early 1980s, NATO would authorize the United States to counter this move by deploying in Europe medium-range American cruise and Pershing II missiles. They would be targeted towards the Soviet Union. The public and private perceptions of President Carter appeared to be different.
The private face of the Carter administration was much tougher and much more aggressive toward the Soviets, and that policy was essentially run by Brzezinski, by Spig Brzezinski, out of the White House as the National Security Advisor. And CIA played a very big role in that in terms of covert action, particularly beginning at the very beginning of 1979. But the fact is, under Brzezinski, a much more aggressive anti-Soviet covert action was initiated as early as the spring of 1977, from the very beginning of the Carter administration.
It took until 1979 to finally come to an agreement on SALT II. But the revelation that a Soviet brigade had remained in Cuba past 1968, and most significantly, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, put détente and arms control negotiations in reverse. The leaders of the Soviet Union were reluctant to invade or to occupy Afghanistan. However, the Soviets finally decided on a full-scale military commitment because of their fear that an anti-Soviet fundamentalist regime on their southern border could destabilize the large Muslim populations within their 5 Central Asian republics. On December 23, 1979, the Soviets deployed 50,000 ground troops into Afghanistan.
And I heard about that move of our troops into Afghanistan, and the first thing I told my family, this is the end of US-Russian relationship, at least for a while. That will be the end of it. It had an enormous damage to the bilateral relationship between Washington and Moscow, definitely so.
The day the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, I gave the president a memo in which the key sentence said, "We now have the opportunity to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam." And if I may add, we did.
the Carter administration executed a strategy to counter the Soviet invasion.
We sent Brezhnev a message on the hotline from the White House straight to the Kremlin. We gave press briefings. I talked to the Pope about the Catholic Church worldwide. I talked to Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL-CIO, about the worldwide boycott of any item of goods moving to or from the Soviet Union by air or rail or ship. And we talked to the European allies. We talked to the Solidarity movement in Poland. We talked to neutrals, like we sent a message to Indira Gandhi asking her to be in touch with Brezhnev. So I think we got their attention.
Moscow advised its allies the invasion was necessary because things were developing in such a way that the achievements of the Soviet global revolution and their democratic progressive regime were in danger of liquidation.
It was a dirty war, and the dead bodies were coming home. And in the Soviet Union, the bureaucracy tried to maintain it in secrecy. Hundreds of thousands of young Soviets did go to Afghanistan, and some died. But the society pretended it didn't exist.
However, the mothers of Russian soldiers who died in combat visibly showed their anguish by demonstrating against the Soviet war in Afghanistan.
It was a mistake. It was an enormous, maybe the greatest mistake ever done after the Second World War. It should not have been done. Imperial Russia knew that nobody should go into Afghanistan. We knew the lessons of the British being there and the problems they had. And we knew you should never touch Afghanistan. It's not that nation that it would allow any kind of interference, especially military one. They would always fight against it. You could never win in Afghanistan.
This war would cost the lives of almost 15,000 Soviet military and an estimated 1 million Afghans. At the conclusion of the 1970s, two significant new capabilities had been added to the Cold War weapons calculus. Each side had developed MIRV systems that expanded the total number of strategic nuclear warheads from 3,400 to over 13,300 by 1980, while still maintaining intercontinental ballistic missile counts in compliance with the SALT I agreement. Since each side had about equal numbers of warheads, mutual assured destruction was still a reality. The second new technology was the cruise missile, an unmanned aircraft that could deliver a nuclear payload at a range of up to 1,500 miles and was extremely difficult to detect and intercept. Capable of ground, air, or sea launch, they added to the destructive capability of each side's arsenal. In addition, the Soviet Union deployed a destabilizing weapon, the highly capable intermediate-range SS-20 ballistic missile. With a 3,000-mile range, it gave them the capability to threaten every city in Western Europe. Paradoxically, the Europeans became extremely concerned with America's willingness to deploy its European-based missiles as a deterrent to Soviet attacks on European targets. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan proved to have a catastrophic effect on Soviet-American relations.
It was a very difficult time. First of all, the relationship has dropped after the introduction of Soviet troops in Afghanistan, and President Carter took certain measures which made the relationship very, very difficult. Some of the actions were considered not only by the government of Moscow, of the Soviet Union, but also by the general public as very insulting, like the actions against the Olympics in Moscow.
Most prominent was the need for Carter to postpone the ratification of SALT II. To the Kremlin's chagrin as well, the Americans began a massive modernization of the U.S. military forces. Within this atmosphere of Americans being held hostage in Iran and with Soviets in Cuba and Afghanistan, Ronald Reagan overwhelmingly defeated Jimmy Carter in his bid for re-election in 1980.
And so the irony is that for a guy who ended his term in office being seen as soft on the Soviet Union and characterized that way in the 1980 election, he probably had the most unrelentingly hostile relationship with the Soviet leadership of any American president in the entire Cold War.
So the end of Carter's presidency was already crowned by a very gloomy mood in Moscow. Probably there was some kind of the same mood in Washington. So the coming of President Reagan was combined with the gloom and certain hope. Some people would say, yes, he's a president who can make things worse. Some say, well, we don't know. We don't know yet, let's hope.
Reagan assumed the presidency in 1981 after nearly 20 years of détente, and by accelerating the momentum of President Carter's last year, orchestrated the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The U.S. military added to its arsenal 100 MIRV MX missiles, 3,000 air-launched cruise missiles, 100 B-1 bombers, a 600-ship Navy with new aircraft carriers, replenished ammunition stocks, plus added new tanks and other conventional weapons. Reagan characterized the Soviet Union as the evil empire and had virtually no dealings with Soviet leadership.
The evil empires.
People were thinking that he was talking about the Soviet Union. He was again talking about the system, but in the minds of the Russians at that time, even of the leaders, even the educated part of the elite, was always, if you talk about bad communism, you mean bad Soviet Union, which were different. It was the 4 years of the first Reagan's presidency was a very difficult time when people here in Moscow thought maybe the relationship would go back, years back, to where they were in the 50s.
The Soviet Union, during détente, had strained every nerve to reach strategic parity with the United States. The Soviets had matched the West in the development and deployment of nuclear weapons, ICBMs, submarines, aircraft, and satellites, but was uncertain in its economic ability to meet the new Western challenges.
In the 50s, in the 60s, I was growing up in this country and I could feel the mood. People saw that life was improving and the Soviet Union was gaining. We launched Sputnik, our friends were winning the wars of national liberation, the United States lost the war in Vietnam. By the 80s, there was no feeling that we were moving anywhere. The standard of living was not growing anymore. The bureaucratic system, which was not very much repressive, but still, well, it produced what was called stagnation, when nothing was really done. It was a kind of a standstill. Internationally, the Soviet Union was also on defensive in Afghanistan and elsewhere, and Reagan was a formidable opponent.
During President Reagan's first term, the chilling atmosphere of the early days of the Cold War returned. The initial hardline U.S. rhetoric and its awesome military buildup, NATO's ability to deploy nuclear-capable Pershing II ballistic missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe, along with breakdowns in arms limitation talks, caused fears of a military confrontation. This led to massive demonstrations in European capitals and the U.S.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own...
On March 23, 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. This was a vastly ambitious research project to develop an anti-missile system based both in space and on the ground. If successful, SDI would nullify most of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. The Soviets believed that the U.S. could develop the technology and provide the resources to deploy SDI. They also knew they could match the effort only at an overwhelming cost. Reagan's offer to share the technology did not calm the Soviets' fear. Economics was having a significant effect on Soviet desire and decision-making.
One of the reasons that the economy was coming to a standstill because, well, the burden of the arms race continued to grow on the Soviet economy, which was trying to maintain the parity, the military balance with the United States, with Europe, with Japan, with China, with the rest of the world. No nation can maintain these conditions of total mobilization forever. The Russian people can stand against many hardships and could have enormous patience. But when decade after decade passed and we still were engaged in this kind of a Cold War which were sucking the blood of the society, that contributed to a situation when there was no more any progress.
The re-election of Margaret Thatcher in Britain and the election of Helmut Kohl in West Germany added to Soviet fears. In this environment, there was a strident, horrified reaction when Soviet defense forces shot down an unarmed Korean airliner, which had mistakenly strayed over the Sakhalin Peninsula in September of 1983.
It was deplorable, and I don't think you will find many Russians who will approve it. Most disapprove it. But it is a rule which exists up till now. It is like with violator, if a person is crossing the border and is not listening to the command to stop and give up, there is an order to shoot at him.
Then, in early November 1983, the U.S. and NATO conducted a full-scale doomsday scenario training exercise designated Able Archer, which was intended to practice nuclear release procedures. This led the Soviets to go on heightened military alert and placed their nuclear forces on standby. The Kremlin feared that Reagan's America was capable of a preemptive nuclear attack. From the standpoint of the Soviet Union, Reagan's policy looked concerted, threatening, and relentless.
Well, in the turn of the 80s, things began to shift in two ways. First, there was Ronald Reagan, who came in and said, we're going to rebuild our military strength. After détente, we had let it lapse in his view, and we were going to rebuild it. The second thing is the Soviets were plagued by one senile general secretary, Brezhnev, at the end of his term, and then two sick ones. And so the momentum was gone from the Soviet Union. They had nobody at the helm.
On March 11, 1985, Soviet leadership selected Mikhail Gorbachev as its new general secretary, and fortunately, a fortuitous interaction evolved between President Reagan and the new Soviet leader. During the following 3 years, summits and regular correspondence occurred between the leaders, which resulted in nothing less than the end of the arms race, the beginning of disarmament, and the dramatic conclusion of the Cold War. At Geneva, Gorbachev and Reagan agreed in principle to work towards strategic arms reduction and cut their nuclear arsenals in half. A year after Geneva at the Reykjavik summit, expectations were high, but SDI became a thorn in the side of progress. When the two leaders conducted private meetings, the West became nervous.
And then they got into that private negotiating session and, well, we'll get rid of ballistic missiles. Well, I'll trump that. We'll get rid of all nuclear weapons. Okay, I'll see you and call. And Gorbachev was unprepared for one thing, and that was that for all of that, Reagan wouldn't give up SDI.
At this stage, Reagan said, but let's put that aside for a minute. Let's talk about SDI. Let's talk about Strategic Defense Initiative. At this point, Gorbachev became livid. He slammed his book and he walked out. And the meeting broke up.
And the whole thing collapsed on that basis. And everybody in the West, below the president, beginning with Margaret Thatcher, breathed a huge sigh of relief because they thought that they'd been on the verge of committing a horrible strategic mistake.
Gorbachev's objective was to remove the threat of all nuclear weapons and leave SDI in the hands of science to create.
There was an enormous sense of disappointment in the eyes of the two gentlemen when they walked out of the room. They have come to the highest possible level of mutual understanding about the desirability of removing the nuclear weapons, of destroying them all. And the only thing was, let's contain the research in this, as far as the space component of the SDI was concerned, to the laboratories.
We were afraid that this is the beginning of the end, and there was a lot of gloom about that meeting, but Reagan came back and talked to the people about it and explained, and the U.S. public came on his side. So it was actually a good meeting, and things moved well from Reykjavik on.
In Washington, in December 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, abolishing all U.S. and Soviet missiles in Europe and changing the traditional diplomatic agenda from arms control to arms reduction. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty of 1992, referred to as START, was a direct outgrowth of the Reykjavik summit. U.S. presidents, as well as many Western leaders, played a momentous role in the ending of the Cold War. However, creating domestic reform within the Soviet Union, which included the policies of perestroika, restructuring the system, and glasnost, establishing openness and eliminating the dream of Soviet world domination, had to be directed by a Soviet leader. Mikhail Gorbachev was that leader. In 1988, George Bush succeeded Ronald Reagan and became president. The road to the end of the Cold War was clear, but a steady hand was necessary. Within the next 3 years, stunning events would occur which would hasten the end of the Cold War.
So we wanted to keep things going at a pace which was slow enough that the Soviets wouldn't say, we've got to send in the troops. And that was a kind of a balancing act. And one of the most famous illustrations of that was when the Berlin Wall was opened, and President Bush gave an interview, and the press was astounded that he was so quiet and low-key. He was quiet and low-key because we did not want the Soviets to react by sending in the troops and killing the baby.
During the Bush administration, the tearing down of the Berlin Wall, liberation of Eastern Europe, the breakup of the Soviet Union into 15 independent countries, the Conventional Forces Treaty, and the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty ended the threat of East-West conflict. There were many sticking points and several crises during these events. The fortunate outcomes were greatly facilitated by lengthy interactions between President Bush and General Secretary Gorbachev, who spent more time together than the total of all previous leaders of the two countries. The Cold War could not end until the Soviets gave up Lenin's dream of world revolution. Mikhail Gorbachev was ready to give up that dream, but wound up, to his surprise, out of office without a Soviet Union to govern.
You see, Gorbachev had his good years and not very good years. The first years when he was in power, up to 89, I think, were very good. It was like a revolution almost. And the good things which still remain in this country can be traced mainly to him and to what he did in these years. Then either he became afraid or he didn't know what to do further. Of course, I didn't expect some things to crumble so quick. And I think they shouldn't have crumbled so quick. You know, it was just because of the internal inconsistencies and controversies, the seeds of distractions which were inside and which were not taken care of in time.
The events of September 11th, 2001 changed the world forever. The multipolar reality of rogue states and global terrorism has significantly replaced the bipolar brinkmanship of the Cold War. The paradigms of deploying nuclear weapons to offset superior conventional forces, the policies of containment, and mutual assured destruction are strategies of the past. It has been nearly 6 decades since the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The primary legacy of the Cold War is the existence of weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, and chemical. Cold War military programs produced over 60,000 nuclear weapons, and also the most toxic agents ever created. Consequently, there is a current threat of chemical and biological weapons on today's world.
Chemical weapons, if you know how to make rodent kill and bug spray and so on and so forth, you can make chemical weapons. They're very simple to make. And biological weapons are particularly insidious. Neither chemical or biological are very effective military weapons. They don't really work for organized armies, but they're very, very useful terror weapons. And so that's going to be a problem for us.
Efforts since 1991 at destroying and eliminating weapons and delivery systems have reduced the risk of total global destruction. However, at least 10 countries now have stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons. Tens of thousands of nuclear weapons also still exist, and nuclear capability has further proliferated to include India and Pakistan. A critical priority for the 21st century is to keep these weapons out of the hands of terrorists. An additional legacy of the Cold War is the belief that nuclear weapons can help to avoid conflict. While this perception was credible during the Cold War, and these weapons may prove to be a useful deterrent against a rogue state, they will have minimal effect on international terrorists. The new reality is that Al-Qaeda and associated extremist groups have a wide variety of potential agents and delivery means to choose from for chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear attacks. In today's world, there is a serious threat that weapons of mass destruction will be used by these fanatic, religious, menacing, and suicidal terrorists. So far, it has been proven they are organized, shadowy, difficult to track and locate, well-financed, and impossible to extinguish by traditional military methods, and enormous arsenals of weaponry. Within this current climate of fear, every aircraft, land vehicle, ship, suitcase or briefcase has become a potential terrorist delivery system. Furthermore, a cataclysmic terrorist attack could very well occur and be significantly more deadly than the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. A reality of the 21st century is that all citizens must become acutely aware of the depth and and dimension of international terrorism and its fundamental causes. Furthermore, every citizen must be empowered to take responsibility and know how to act when or if an attack occurs, and comprehend the existence of a changing world.